Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Eric Kaufmann, Professor Eric Kaufmann, Professor of Politics at the University of Buckingham. So, Eric, really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Welcome.
Good to be here, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Now, we've got lots of things to talk about. Eric's interests, academic interests, overlap very substantially with the interests of the Scottish Family Party. But before we get into that, do you want to tell us a little bit about your role and the University of Buckingham and your journey into your role that you're currently fulfilling?
Well, yeah. So, I taught within the mainstream system, if you like, for about 24 years, 4 years Southampton, 20 years at Birkbeck College, University of London. And then, I had, starting in about 2018, cancellation attempts by radicals and internal complaints and these sorts of things. Mainly because, I was really starting to become critical of the so-called social justice movement in its various manifestations. And that was deemed unacceptable. And now it doesn't, most of my colleagues, I'd known for a long time that was fine. The top levels of the university were reasonable, but it's just, it's not enough to drive me out, but it wasn't particularly a conducive environment. And I was worried about censorship of research and this kind of thing. And then Buckingham, I knew, were taking the lead on the free speech front as in terms of being a new university that, well, not new university, but a university of the only one out of 181 in Britain that valued viewpoint diversity and wanted to, push back a little bit on the kind of, sensitivity cancel culture that's really exploded, in the last, 5 to 10 years, maybe. And yeah, so then I thought, well, at some point, I going to do this. And then it eventually came together after I left Birkbeck I guess October. I've been at Buckingham. It's been a real breath of fresh air. Now, of course, Buckingham is the university itself is not that different from other universities. Even as a private university, it at one time that would have been a difference, but now their fees are probably even slightly below that of the standard public university.
Okay. So private, what difference does that make then? Does that mean that there's not government funding, I assume, going into it? But if the fees are similar, how does that all work out?
I think, at one time it would have been quite different when then all the other universities were completely funded for free. You could go and attend for free as a student. And now I think because of the introduction of fees in the other universities, there isn't really a difference in terms of the private public. In terms of regulations, I think Buckingham is subject to some of them and not others. So they are maybe slightly less regulated, but I still think it's not vastly different. So in some ways, the original rationale is no longer as strong as it once was, the private public. I think the rationale now has to kind of shift more towards the ethos that freedom and truth are central to Buckingham, and they are not central really in the same way at other universities where sensitivity to let's say the views of the most thin-skinned member of a designated minority group, or those who speak on behalf of those designated minority groups, that's the top priority, is not running afoul of that. So the so-called social justice agenda is probably number one, with truth and freedom number two.
Yeah. It's interesting, in Scotland, there's a body called the Scottish Funding Council, who oversee university funding. And they very much push the sort of social justice ideology. And it's obviously implicit. I mean, if you have the funding body pushing this ideology, the implicit message is pretty clear, isn't it? We're expecting you to toe the line in order to get your money. It's pretty insidious. Now, I don't know if it's as bad in England with the non-private universities, but
it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. So the RCUK and then the research councils, they're building a lot of this into they're planning to put it into the next research assessment. A lot of you look at the grants, you look at the guidance to applicants, there's a lot of stuff in there that is not related to excellence, truth, and academic freedom, but to the social justice priority. So it's corrupting the entire enterprise, really. But even more so, in the universities themselves, there's probably not that much difference between Scotland and England in the kind of peer pressures. if you really want to be promoted and published and get money, and you have to toe the line. You certainly can't
Mhm.
research certain topics, or you're across the line and therefore shunned and ostracized, really.
Yeah. I mean, this is a fascinating area. I'd be interested to hear more of your insights into it. So how have we got into this situation? Are there some sort of natural processes that result in academics having particularly sort of left, liberal, progressive, secular values, or is there more going on? How have we ended up here? Or was it ever thus?
Well, to some degree, it was forever thus. I mean, academics like those in the arts, and to some degree, to a lesser extent, journalists have long trended to the left. But the extremism, the monoculture has gotten worse. So, for example, in
Mhm.
both the US and Britain, in the social sciences, it's gone from something like 3 to 1 left to right to nine or 10 to 1 left to right. And
Mhm.
now at the top universities, it's even more extreme. I mean, Harvard, 82 to 1 liberal to conservative is where we are now. We've got donations data, which doesn't lie. It's like 98% a Democrat, 1% to 2% Republican. So, I mean, that's really where the situation is, at the very top of
Mhm.
the food chain in terms of, social science and humanities academia. Yeah, how does that happen? I mean, there's two kind of main theories, I'd say. One is that it's a sort of a cultural version of Marxism or socialism, that they gave up on the working class and they moved to identity,
Mhm.
and then hired their own, and multiplied themselves within the institutions. Um, the other, which is closer to the view I hold, is that essentially left liberalism, based not on revolution but based on guilt and compassion, was
Mhm.
very susceptible to the claims of the radicals, and therefore gleefully accepted them in and didn't resist them, and eagerly consumes their output, and is
Mhm.
the key enabler. So, and that is really a kind of evolutionary, incremental, step by step. Let's just be more and more and more sensitive. We'll go from crippled to disabled to differently able to, or
Mhm.
this evolution of terminology for groups, Chicano, Latino, Latinx, etc. These are all indicators of this kind of slow boiling to radicalism of left
Mhm.
liberalism, which I think just evolves towards getting more and more and more radical, because it wants to be more and more sensitive, and more intolerant. So I think the kind of left liberal and the cultural sort of Marxist strain coming together is how we are where we are. And it's not just universities. I think it's in the arts, and it's also actually in public opinion, particularly younger people, and particularly young people at elite universities. So I think it's much broader than the university itself, but the university is kind of one place where you get a concentration.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. A few points I'd be interested to hear your take on, following on from that. I've sometimes thought, social scientists, for example, tend to be left leaning. Whereas if you go to, the maths or the physics department, you probably find a more even balance. But in maths and physics, they don't really have the opportunity to be promoting their political views because it's not part of the topic. Is that part of the phenomenon, do you think?
Yes, although I would say that the STEM fields have moved left as well in terms of the voting and ideology. But the difference that shows up in the surveys is that you have a smaller share of people who call themselves far left, radical, activist in the STEM fields.
Okay.
You don't have more conservatives, but you have fewer of the radical left. It's maybe half as high as it is in the social sciences and humanity. That's the main difference today, I would say.
Mhm.
So it's not that it's balanced politically, but at least there isn't the same extremism on the left.
Yeah. There's the values as well. I've heard people say that basically a lot of academics, they see their mission as making the world a better place. So their academic career and activities and teaching is part of their activism. It's part of their mission to make the world a better place. So they're trying to turn their students into activists as well. Would you agree with that? That they go beyond trying to teach their ideas; they're actively trying to turn students into activists in their cause as well.
Yeah, I think definitely some are, and it's worse in certain disciplines than in others. Probably most academics are not that way. I mean, they may make a joke about the Tories or something, which isn't great in terms of political bias, but teaching activism, I think, is probably a minority. But in
Mhm.
certain disciplines, it would be a majority. But it just depends on the department, a lot of academics are activists. It's still a minority again, but I think there's a larger share of those amongst younger academics entering the system. That's the worry for me, is that looking at the trend by age, it's really quite concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. My final question on this topic is going to be, what can we do about it? Well, one little question before then. I feel one of the effects from this, you've got this very skewed social science academic establishment that produce research that supports its own values or is interpreted to support its own values. And that enables a whole section of the political spectrum to claim that their policies are evidence-based and to constantly wheel out academics to back them up. And that's quite a formidable opponent to deal with when you've got people who are absolutely certain that their sort of left progressive or whatever view is based on the academic facts. The facts of research support their view. That's very challenging, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it is. And of course, the reality is a lot of the arguments, a lot of this rests on sand. If you actually delve down, so they'll name drop and cite, but if you actually delve down into who those sites are and what they're writing and what their method is, it's flimsy. It's not based on falsifiability, measurement, rigorous modeling. It's based upon essentially meta theories like critical race theory or radical feminism that just assert things like prejudice plus power. Racism equals prejudice plus power. It's actually nonsensical, but somehow if people just echo each other, then that becomes knowledge, and it's laundered through into expertise, and it's an expert, and you just don't question, even though the expertise is based on shoddy so anti-positivist, anti-scientific methodologies, which are rampant. I mean, there were a whole series of hoax papers James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian did, where they just showed that you could publish anything in some of these journals, as long as you tick the name check the right ideologies and tick the right emotional boxes. So you have a whole literature that's based essentially on nothing but emotion and politics, and that somehow becomes expertise, right? So
the thing I find frustrating, sometimes when I appear in the media doing an interview, the people on the other side, they'll be stating various facts, and the interviewer, okay, fine, thanks for sharing that with us. Then I'll say, actually, there's some research that indicates this. Prove it. Who did it? Where was it from? Show it to us. Total absolute skepticism towards that. Absolute unquestioned acceptance.
It's playing the man, not the ball. Ad hominem. It's the cheapest, oldest trick in the rhetorical book, and it just. These are all games that are played in terms of rhetoric, but they, again, if I'd say drill down into the actual research methodology, and it's generally flimsy.
So what's the way forward? I mean, there's no easy answer, is there? There's no magic bullet. But do you see things getting worse before they get better, or do you see green shoots of hope in addition to Buckingham University?
I think, I do think it's going to get worse. I'm sorry to say that. I mean, I think we're on a bit of a wavelet, on a rising swell, but a falling wavelet, right? So people are mistaking some of the kickback against DEI more in the US. We have the Higher Education Freedom Bill, which is an important bill, which will come into effect in August, not in Scotland, unfortunately. But so there are some positive things that have happened, but I think the problem is that the generational trend is towards prioritizing, again, this idea of equal outcomes and emotional harm protection for designated groups as the paramount value. And if we can fit some free speech and truth seeking underneath that, we'll do it. But if it collides, then it's got to go. That sort of value set, I think, is in the ascendant, and younger academics are twice as intolerant as older academics. So I'm worried where we're going to be in 20 years. I really am. Now, what can we do about it? We can go for a legislative approach, which I think is important to protect people from being fired. We also can go for what we're trying to do with the Center for Heterodox Social Science is just to create pockets where free thinking, that dissenting thinking, can live without the kind of repression that exists in a normal environment. So at least, and if we can leverage that, get that research out, publicize it, amplify it, then at least we can try and correct the skew that is so prominent within the mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, another issue that I'm fascinated in, that I know you've given some thought to, Yeah, it's so LGBT identities and their associated outcomes in terms of mental health, etc. We find certainly in Scotland, we're also taught in schools, LGBT, if you decide to go down any of those paths, normal, natural, and healthy. And the only problem potentially associated with this is stigma and discrimination. If we just sort those out, everything will be rosy. But the truth is different, would you say?
Yeah, I think the truth is different. I mean, I think there's a distinction to be made between what I would call real lesbians and gays and people who are identifying with that label and category. I think the mental health, I mean, I've done some analysis on this, published a piece in Quillette, which kind of shows that it's particularly these LGBT identifiers who actually don't have the same sex behavior, but those are the people that have the highest mental health issues. Now, of course, as a group, if you look at mental health amongst teens, there was a CDC study in the US, LGBT identifying teens, and that's a significant group. Now, I mean, in some surveys, it reaches 25, 30%, although the census tells us it's only about a third or a quarter of that. But still, that group, has about 75% reporting mental health issues, compared to something like 45, which is still very high in the teen 15 to 19 population. Yeah, and these things are always heavily correlated, and the correlation seems to have gotten higher at a time when anti-LGBT prejudice has been declining, actually, in terms of which we can show in these attitude survey data very clearly. Just doesn't fit the narrative that it's just all, the higher mental health is all because of discrimination. So I think there's another factor going on. We need to be able to explore what, in a normal world, we'd be able to unpack that and say, okay, what's causing this? What is the correlation being driven by? Could there be some sort of a cultural factor that is behind this, an ideology that is behind this, that is making people identify as different or divergent because that's seen as interesting or somehow radical, and that maybe leads them to be, less settled, less bounded in their identity and their identity with society. Let's have that conversation, but it's very, very difficult to have that conversation. Now, the other thing I should say, by the way, is that this LGBT identification explosion has occurred almost entirely amongst those on the very left side of the spectrum, I mean, young people. So this is concentrated among certain groups, ideological groups. And we also know, by the way, that those same ideological groups also have very much higher mental health reporting than those who are in the center or conservative. Jonathan Haidt's talking about this in his new book, whose name escapes me, and it's going to be published in March. But he talked, you can see the charts very clearly that it is very liberal or very left individuals that have much higher rates, reporting much higher rates of mental health problems than those in the center or conservatives. Again, do we have research on why that is? We have a little bit, but it demands more explanation, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, one explanation, the standard one would be that the experience of LGBT or transgender in particular leads to these mental health problems because of the difficulties people face. It might be that for example, with transgenderism, trying to live according to that identity might generate its own tensions, or could it be that these are very sensitive things to talk about, or there might be some factor in someone's psyche or in their mind that there's going wrong in some way, and that might result in fruit in these different ways. I mean, they're very sensitive areas, but you would hope that these things would be researched very thoroughly and people could try and reach conclusions. But surely a lot of people don't want to reach conclusions because some of them are so unpalatable to them.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a rich research tradition around what's called anomie, where, if you have indeterminacy in your life, that can lead to mental distress. And so, for example, even there's a book looking at the 18th and 19th century, the shift from where you were, if your father was a blacksmith, you were a blacksmith and your status was very fixed. And then we move into the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the nation state, and those distinctions are removed, and there's more fluidity, and then there was more mental illness, partly because so this idea that if you have more choice and less determinacy in your roles, in your identities, then there's that introduces it introduces distress. And similarly, if your gender is up for grabs now, if your sexuality is up for grabs, then these sorts of things also, I think, introduce a certain amount of mental distress. I mean, I think that would be a fruitful line of research, that kind of idea that anomie is created by the narrative around the fluidity of sex and gender. And again, that's something we would need. We can test that. Maybe the argument is wrong, and maybe their argument is right, but we need to be able to have an open climate where we can, in a spirit of good faith, test both these arguments, see what comes up. But that's just not where academia is, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So if you were in charge of the curriculum in Scotland in terms of education around LGBT issues, what message would you deliver? So, for example, think about transgenderism. Do you think it would be appropriate for young people to be told, that's what transgenderism means, that these are some problems that tend to be associated with it? Or in terms of LGBT identity as well, that these are some things that correlate with it, at least. Do you think it's appropriate for people to be made aware of the state of knowledge at the moment? Or do you feel it's too...
Well, I mean, I would rather these things not even be in the curriculum.
Right.
These are private matters, how people identify. I think even a message, you can have a message of tolerance, but then what I would say is then that's got to be a message of tolerance to all groups, including different religions. It could be different stripes of Christianity. It could be people who are introverts and extroverts, people who are not very bright and people who are very... I mean, if you dealt with the whole range of human variation, amongst which sexuality and gender is there, fine. But it's this heavy focus on the politically, important symbols: race, gender, sexuality. Those are the key politically important symbols. Whereas the other stuff, we're not going to talk about, hair color, left and right-handed, introversion, class. None of these things are important, because politically, the symbols that are really important for the woke movement are around race, gender, and sexuality. So that's where they're going to go. So I want to decenter those things and talk about a wider range of things, and not just talk about inequality. Let's talk about social cohesion and beauty and excellence and all these other facets of human flourishing that are being ignored. So I would just like to see it shrunk to become a less prominent part of the curriculum.
Yeah, I agree with that. Entirely. But I think some things like alcohol, for example, alcohol, smoking, drugs, there's various things that are taught about to children from the point of view of there are some risks associated with these things that you need to be aware of. But do you think when it comes to LGBT, or in particular transgender identity, do you think there's a place for some sort of health warning, if you like?
I think,
at least.
I guess because I'm generally a proponent of politically neutralizing the politics out of and these things are politically coded. I mean, you are right in a way that, the reality is you'll be happier, as a straight conservative, etc. But I'm just not sure about introducing that in the classroom. I think we should be able to have that discussion in the media freely. And yeah, I think, that the trans issue is tricky because, I certainly do not believe that schools should be trying to introduce this identity to people as, hey, you can choose this on a menu instead of that. I think that should be a private matter up to individuals. And so I just would like to see all this stuff really out of the schools or shrunk, because we don't want to be socializing people to think a certain way. I mean, we can have a debate over how much of this is innate versus a social contagion or fashion. But again, I just don't see the utility of putting that in the classroom in front of kids. I would like them to be learning more practical skills. And yeah, I mean, you can have debates. Perhaps in the upper years, we can have a debate over is trans something that is nature or nurture? Is it something that, I don't know. I still think it's tricky in today's climate. I'm sort of still inclining towards depoliticizing, right? Because the problem is any such discussion will always skew one way because of the nature of the incentives, and who comes into the teaching profession now is still also somewhat skewed, not as much as academia, but it's still somewhat skewed, and what they're getting in the teachers college is skewed. So I just wouldn't necessarily trust it to be a balanced discussion.
No. What happens at the moment in Scotland is that the curriculum in these areas will be presented, and some teachers will say, I'm really not comfortable teaching that. And the school's response is, oh, okay, no problem. We've got someone else who will. We've got someone who's just come from college, so they'll do it. So no problem. You're going to teach a bit more maths. We've got people to cover these things. So, well, that's very interesting. Let's move on to the next area, which family structure and its implications. Because the standard belief is that all children need is love. If they've got two parents, ideally, that's fine. But basically, all they need is love. And the idea that any particular family structure or relationship structure is better or worse is a serious heresy in our society. I mean, is that the general understanding in the academic establishment as well, would you say?
Well, I think the reality is, if you really look at the data, there's no question that intact families and marriage is a formula for success, has much better outcomes, in terms of economics, in terms of well-being, and all kinds of things. Ideally, that is something we would be encouraging. Here's the issue, right? I mean, we obviously don't want to malign a single parent, a single mother, but we don't seem to be able to have these discussions anymore where we can talk. Can we talk about the NHS, let's say the National Health Service, without, if we criticize the National Health Service, does that mean we're criticizing a particular nurse or a particular doctor? I mean, or if we're criticizing the military, are we criticizing a particular soldier? Somehow, when it gets to sort of talking about encouraging certain kinds of family structures, etc., that are conducive to success, that somehow has to always be phrased as you're excluding and maligning the single parent or someone who was raised in a single parent family. No, not at all. I mean, many are doing good jobs, many will do just fine, but on average, if we take the means, it's not as good an outcome. And we have to be able to, as a mature society, be able to have those discussions about collective phenomena and not commit what's known as the fallacy of composition, going from the collective down to the level of the individual. And that's the way that particularly the left always argues. You want to have a debate about some collective aggregate phenomena, they always want to collapse it into a question about who you're excluding, personalize everything. And you just can't have a policy debate when that's the attitude.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In terms of policy debate, it's an excluded topic. As soon as it's raised, it's a real taboo. You cannot talk about it. You can't tell people how to live their lives, even though the government tells people how to live their lives in virtually every other regard. When it comes to this one, though, it's a serious taboo. It's very offensive to touch it. But how about marriage itself? Now, I've looked into this a little bit about the evidence. I think the correlations are overwhelming that marriage correlates with more positive outcome for adult children on virtually everything we can measure. But some people push back and say that it's actually a different cause that's behind it. It's that the people who get married are the most committed. So the actual getting married, that's not really what makes the difference. It's other factors that lead to them getting married. Now, can that sort of question even be answered adequately, or do you think that there is an answer to it?
I think it can be answered adequately. Now, this is not an area that I've done a lot of research on myself, but there are certain methods. So there are surveys that allow you to track people over time. So if somebody over time gets married, you can look for, and things improve. Maybe their well-being improves, maybe their income improves within the same individual. Then that's, that rules out a lot of these other factors that are associated with the kind of person that might get married. So there are different methodological strategies. You can do, experiments of different kinds. So yes, I would say there are methods. Of course, there are very few researchers willing to do this work. There are some. I mean, Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia and the Institute for Family Studies, you may or may not know them. They're doing great work. And Brad's got a new book out on marriage, which is very data-based, and so there are researchers, but of course what will then happen is the mainstream in academia will either ignore or sideline or essentially not really grapple honestly with the data, or just ignore it, and therefore hope that the current consensus persists, and it does, right? So it's quite an effective strategy. Although I will say that in the national press and media, Brad's having impact, the Institute for Family Studies is having an impact, and so I still have a hope that even if academia is controlled by one side, the broader societal conversation is richer than that and can help to bring in these findings from, people like Brad.
Yeah, yeah. Well, is it? I've heard it explained that they understand that the traditional sort of academic establishment, everything comes down to money and discrimination. They're like the root causes of everything. Whereas choices and values are very much downplayed. It's almost taboo to talk about the consequences of people's choices and the values that they hold. Would you agree with that? That's a fair.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The incentives, the emphasis is all on stratification and inequality and discrimination, or as you say, something to do with class and economic position. I mean, it's just it's very much a left-wing biased field, and what's not studied is certain cultures. There's a different emphasis in different cultures. I mean, Thomas Sowell, and it can change over time. I mean, at one time the Germans were known for being starry-eyed romantic poets, and then they became known for being sort of frugal, industrial people. These images change over time, and it's happened with the Irish perhaps more recently. Thomas Sowell talks about African Americans, who were, had a very lower, they were in prison at a lower rate than whites. They had, were low crime. They went to school. They were doing all the things that you would have thought would be conducive and were conducive to success under a Jim Crow discrimination regime. And then there was a shift in the 60s as a result of the sexual revolution and the counterculture. So you can actually analyze culture as a separate variable that drives behavior, and this is something that is just academia is allergic to. Everything's about racism. If you talk about some cultures emphasizing saving and book learning, and others emphasizing sport and music more at certain times, not in the DNA, but at certain that's just not a conversation they can have without pointing the finger and accusing you of being a racist. And it just
I've listened to Thomas Sowell the other day. Actually, he was talking about the North and South of America. I mean, this is a very crude characterization of what he was saying. He was basically saying people in the South tended to be lazier, so the economy didn't develop as quickly. And he said the Scots who went to the south of the United States were not particularly industrious. I know some people might take. I
think it was the Scotch Irish he was talking about, but yeah, I think so.
Now, is this an inevitable issue within a democracy? Within a democracy, it's not a great sell to be telling people they're making bad choices and then the values they're building their life on are faulty, so they need to rethink what they're doing. There's not really many. You can't appeal to voters on the basis that I want to help you, and the way I'm going to help you is I want to help you to change your values. That's not really a democratic pitch, is it?
I think the mass public and the voters are much more nuanced than academics, and that would, if you take groups like African Americans, they're much more nuanced than the sort of critical race type discourse in academia. They would have a different view on affirmative action, on crime. They would think culture matters. I mean, survey data shows this, that they would see culture as important in a way that academics would refuse to. And so I don't think it's the problems with the voters. I think the problem is with the elite ideologies that are being propounded inside our elite institutions like the university, but not only the university, certainly schools now and corporations and arts councils and foundations. And so until we actually are able to reverse course on this very sort of, again, it's all about emotional safety and fragility and protection from this sort of therapeutic version of the cultural left, until we're able to move towards a more resilient, more older Enlightenment type approach that is more fact-based and reality-based, and I think most people are ready for that. I think the public is actually reasonably resilient, and but somehow this cluster of ideas has just metastasized and developed, and the logic of it has just expanded and expanded to the point where we are now in this ridiculous position of denying all kinds of realities in the name of sensitivity towards a particular trinity of sacred groups, really. And it's not doing those groups any good, because if you invent a reason for a group not doing well, if you say it's all about systemic racism, which is never measurable, you're actually obscuring the real reasons for the lack of success. And if you knew the real reasons, you could devise policies to address the real reasons. But because you are pretending that those are not the real reasons, then you can never hope to close the gap. I think it's just an exercise in futility, and it's actually damaging. I mean, you look at the whole George Floyd thing and the defund the police movement, and the result of that is, thousands of Black lives lost, a real setback to Black progress and Black neighborhoods, and this is really a movement that elite white liberals can indulge in, and some minority liberals can indulge in, and it just damages the communities they claim to be helping.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if people are given the message that you're very likely to be a victim of discrimination. I mean, everyone has disappointments in life. Things don't go your way. And if someone's given the mindset to immediately think that might well be because someone was, they're out to get me, that was racist, it's just inevitable that people are going to chalk up a string of experiences that might, even if they're not certain, they might well have been to the racism. That's a really debilitating mindset.
I did a study that, I did a little experiment and had people read a bit of a sample of Black respondents read a chunk of Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is one of these popular critical race theory writers, and then ask them about whether just one of the standard psychological questions on locus of control. How much do you feel you're in control of your life and you can make your life plans work out? And it was much lower amongst those who'd read the passage than amongst those who hadn't. It's just an example of when you make people feel powerless, that their fate is in the hands of some kind of faceless white majority who are discriminating against them, then that's going to sap some of their belief in themselves, which is crucial for well-being and for success. So yeah, it's just I think it's gone far beyond anything useful, and in fact has become negative on all counts. But how you can push back against this when this ideology is so entrenched in our institutions.
Yeah, but it seems to be with the Black Lives Matter thing, so with a lot of other things as well, there's a trigger that's very sort of very emotional incident or issue, and then just the tidal wave becomes absolutely overwhelming, sweeps through the media, business, sport, academia, it's everywhere. It's almost unstoppable. I mean, churches even. But the Black Lives Matter, I found it quite frightening to the degree to which it just became all-consuming across a huge, almost like the whole of society.
Yeah,
I mean, the one that always gets me is sport. You just want to turn on the television and watch a sporting event, but you've got to have your dose of this ideology before you get into it. Not too many years ago, I think it would have been unthinkable that a sort of political movement could gain that sort of traction within like every field of life. But it's really
it's just an emotional contagion, a wave of religious enthusiasm. There are, of course, some people who are cynically deploying it to virtue signal because they think that'll help their brand, and others who are afraid. But I also think there's a lot of genuine belief in this thing, that somehow that this is sort of the moral way forward. It's partly a period of moral uncertainty that people are grasping for certainty, and I think that's part of this. The other part of it, however, is we've had this anti-racism taboo, and it's fine to have a norm against racism, and I think that's a good thing, although I think it needs to be proportionate and more similar to norms against class prejudice and other kinds of religious prejudice and other kinds of prejudice. But because it's such a tripwire, a sudden death thing, there's no real bounds on it. You then it incentivizes political entrepreneurs to call people racist, to sort of call practices like, mispronouncing somebody's name, that's racism. Borrowing from wearing the costume of another culture, that's racism. Even going hiking is racist. So this is this process of just concept creep and mission creep in the meaning of these terms, as driven by these activist entrepreneurs, and nobody's stopping that. There's nothing. So there's no guardrails in this woke movement that would prevent a ridiculous expansion of this term. And so it's just a very handy political resource to weaponize and wield. And so unfortunately, we're seeing the kind of runaway development of that taboo, which, by the way, originates in the mid-'60s in the US and has been slowly, this process of concept creep has been sort of germinating since for the last sort of 50 years. And we're reaching a kind of crescendo. And until we unpick and moderate that taboo, we're never going to actually solve this problem.
No. I think with things like racism, well, I was a teacher for many years, and there'd be various sort of anti-racist things, programs, deliberate lessons or whatever. But in my experience, there were only really two, it was a boys' school, two boys I would say were genuinely racist. And both of them, it wasn't that they had a blind spot about racial prejudice, it's that they were dark characters. And if you look at the rest of the behavior, I mean, they were up to all sorts, and they were just very, very disturbed, unpleasant in some ways, possibly dangerous characters. Whereas the thinking now seems to be that like racism is this particular misunderstanding that we can educate people out of. But I think obviously it's not. Racism is a symptom of bad character, as lots of other types of bad behavior are. So the focus needs to be on character. If someone respects other people, empathizes with people, wants to treat people well, etc., then you don't need to have a lesson about racism and homophobia and all these other things. It's all under good character, being a good person. But that is very much receding.
It's also instructive too that Asian on black, black on Asian, anything on white is fine. Prejudice within racial groups, say if it was West Indian versus African, if it was Hindu Muslim, if it was, these other things are simply seen as not being racism. So there's a real sort of binary totalizing majority, minority, white, non-white view of the world, which is not even close to reality. In fact, the rates of hate crime as committed by minorities is much higher than by whites. I mean, none of these things enter into the psyche. So it's a very kind of politicized, reductive, unnuanced view of the world that's being pushed, because that's the ideology. Those are the sacred totems. We have a set of sacred groups, and then we have white male, which is the fallen. And it's how many oppression points you have, tells you who you can punch and who you have to just defer to. So until we kind of upend that and treat each other as equals, I think we're going to be in trouble.
How do you see things playing out in the years to come? As I say, things are pretty bad. Are they getting? And the 2020 they became far, far worse. Maybe it's plateaued since then, or has embedded itself since then. How do you see things playing out?
Well, I think if we look back, we can see there have been these awakenings. There have been three: late 1960s, early 90s, and then post 2012, 13, 14, something like that. There's a peak, it falls back a little bit. So we're in the falling back. There's been some cutting back of DEI programs in some US states. There's been some editorials, even in the New York Times, against, cancel culture. So there's been a little bit of a pushback. But I think those who think, oh, that's the end of woke, are just kidding themselves. I mean, people said that about political correctness in the 90s, and look where we are today. And I think, I think the momentum is very much with this. It's routinized and it's kind of ambient now in bureaucratic practices, and it's become just part of the lexicon. And I think it's like we've trimmed the bush back, but it's going to surge. Another white policeman kills a black unarmed black man, etc. Then we'll be right back there again. I think until we actually address the ideology. Now, where I am hopeful is, I think the political counter-mobilization is more advanced than it was in the 90s.
Yeah.
In the 90s, you did, in the US case, you did have an official English movement in 25 states or something, and you did have some pickup, but this was never deciding elections, and now it is. And now, certainly, right of center parties, not in this so much in Britain, to some degree in Britain, but certainly if you look at the Republican Party, they were nodding through a lot of the kind of extensions of the equality law right up until the mid 2000s and affirmative action. They were unwilling to question it. That's changed, and I think if we can get culture war issues around speech boundaries, around national heritage to be deciding elections, the public is 2-1 against the woke position. If that starts to happen and the left says, actually, this is too costly and we have to tack away from the radical agenda on culture wars, then I think we have a chance. And the right really has to be the pioneer. They have to start regulating, breaking into the school system, into the civil service, and depoliticizing, getting rid of the DEI, decentering the race, gender, sex, woke agenda. If they can do that, and also in the US case, executive orders abolishing affirmative action, abolishing disparate impact, and a whole bunch of other innovations, then I think we've got a chance to at least get the institutions looking a bit more like society. But then we still have to work on the young people, which is why curriculum reform in the schools has to be a top priority, I would say, for conservatives.
Yeah.
And that'll embolden the reasonable center left, who I think can be arbitrable and then can have some impact on their movements.
Yeah, yeah. Do you find some of these issues on the political stage that they're very much talked about, the hot topics for the years between elections? When it comes to election campaign time, in Britain, in any case, they tend to fall off the agenda. You know, if you watch the leaders' debate, it's going to be NHS. You know, how many teachers are we going to get? Are the police going to get more money? It becomes all these things. And then as soon as the election's over, attention turns back to the cultural topics.
Yeah.
Is that a deliberate strategy? Is that the way the media like it? Or
Well, here's the thing. I mean, Richard, certainly, obviously, NHS and the economy are top priorities for voters. But, you know, think about an issue like Britain's membership of the EU. That was a very low priority issue for most voters, even though most voters were not particularly well disposed to the EU. It was a low priority. And then suddenly it becomes associated with a high priority issue, immigration. And that's what really boosts it. So what is actually needed is a properly conservative party that can form a link between these issues around speech suppression in the name of sensitivity and a whole host of practical real world problems. So, for example, immigration, the fact we can't have a discussion over immigration, crime and policing, again, because we can't have a conversation about that, we're not able to adequately address crime, health, education, to tie in those more concrete bread and butter issues with these cultural issues, because a lot of voters don't understand the connection, even though the connection is very powerful. Because if you can't, and I think that it just the way that you know, the Brexit movement was able to link this idea of the EU with the question of immigration successfully and raise the profile of the EU as an issue. I think likewise, and regardless of whether you voted Remain or Leave, I mean, that is an effective strategy, and I think that's probably where the conservative movement needs to go, and I think where it will go, and I think probably the US will probably lead the way in this regard. But still, I think what we're going to see is a rising profile of these issues. Now, of course, when we're in a pandemic or we've got very high inflation, clearly those are going to dominate. But as those things tail off, and hopefully some of the foreign policy issues start to tail off, there'll be more oxygen for these cultural issues. Yeah,
that's very interesting. Very interesting. I sometimes think with the NHS, when people are asked in opinion polls, what's your top priority? They think, oh, NHS. But then they might hear all the leaders of the party speaking about the NHS, but there's not really anything to distinguish them from each other, because they're all saying they're totally in favour of the NHS. They want to sort it out and put more money into it or whatever. So the people say it's the top priority, but it's hard to see how it actually determines how they make a decision about how they vote, because the parties are all saying the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, those are what political scientists we would call valence or competency issues. It's just about who's a better manager for the economy of the NHS. They both roughly have the same ideas. I don't think there's much of a paperclip between them. but when it comes to determining who's voting for who, it's these cultural values that are doing much more of the work. Your view of Black Lives Matter, your view of, should transgender women access female space, these kinds of questions are going to pick out who votes conservative versus labor much better. And I think that will become more and more clear over time. So ultimately, parties, to the extent they can raise, like the conservatives, particularly in issues where they have an advantage, such as these culture war issues, they need to be trying to do all they can to raise the priority of these issues and tie them to these other everyday concerns, because that's where they have an advantage. Force labor on the defensive, put them on the spot more. They do it a little bit, but it needs to happen more. So I foresee these issues, because they are foundational in our civilization, to our democracy. I just do not see them going away. I see them becoming more and more salient. It's just that you have to find the right politician who could forge the right linkages and get people to understand that these aren't just abstract, pointy-headed issues. They actually have material impacts on things people care about in their daily lives.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We've only got a few minutes left, but I do want to touch on another very important topic where you have got a lot of expertise, and that's demography. Obviously, there's huge concerns that the population of the UK, and Scotland in particular, is going to decline very dramatically in decades to come, causing all sorts of problems. Very briefly, what are the key factors, and what can be done about it, do you think?
Yeah, so you have something called demographic momentum, which means that if your fertility rate, the number of children a woman will have over her lifetime, if it falls below the replacement level of 2.1 per woman, then approximately 40 years later, you're going to start to see absolute population decline in the absence of immigration. And so the question is, I would say a couple of things. One is, how do you increase the fertility rate? And there are, I would say there's been a lot of trial and error, but there are some indications that you can at least make a difference at the margins of a 0.2, 0.3. There's also, so the question is, what's going to happen long term if this doesn't change? And it seems to be very much linked to culture. So people who are regular religious attenders, for example, in almost every Western country, have a replacement level fertility generally, and it's clearly the case that culture and community are the biggest factor, not education level, income level. And these sorts of material factors, price of housing, the fertility rate is not astronomically higher in Liverpool than it would be in London, so despite the house price differential. So that's not, or even the house price to income ratio. So these material factors, I don't think, are a key in the developed world. They matter in the developing world, but now, in the very long run, there's two possibilities. One is that those that are, I did a book on religion and demographies, where those who are regular religious attenders are likely to form more of the population in the future because of this dynamic. The other possibility is we're going through a kind of, a kind of population bottleneck. Only people with the genes that favor preferring to have larger families or children will be still there in God knows how many generations. So either there's a genetic or there's a cultural way that forward. Now, I mean, there could be other trends and cultural factors that might reverse, but the problem in a way is, as the sort of second demographic transition theorists would argue, because the link between sex and procreation has been broken by contraception and other factors. You don't need large families to work the land or for your old age retirement. A lot of the material incentives are gone. And so really, in the old days, you used to have a lot of kids no matter what, because many of them would die, and you needed these material benefits of large families. That no longer exists. So it comes down to values, and values such as being religious or being secular, preferring kids, not preferring to be single. That is what's driving, I think, selection pressure in the population. And so now, what do you do about that? I mean, one argument is that, you just have to adapt by trying to get more older people, get them to stay into the workforce, trying to mechanize, trying to there are various ways in which you can adapt to a older, lower, not as fast growing a society and still have a very good standard of living until such time as we can come out of this. I think the immigration solution is not a solution for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is that, most countries of the world are now below replacement where immigrants are coming from. They're going to age. What happens if we turn the immigration tap off? We're then going to have this big population of immigrants who've aged and no one to pay their pension. The whole thing's a bit of a Ponzi scheme. So ultimately, we have to deal with the fertility issue.
Yeah. Now, just one last thing before we wind up. What you said about how religious people tend to have more children. I mean, I'm a Christian. I would say in my church, you can see that. I would say there are a lot of kids around. And I would imagine the average fertility rate in my church is probably reasonably high. But it's not something that's spoken about. No, it's not something, once in a while that the preacher will say, come on, everyone, have lots of kids. So what is the effect there? What are the causes at play resulting in religious people having more children?
Well, I just think that I would point. What are the causes at play? Is it's perhaps a more optimistic view of the future. Perhaps it's pronatalism in Scripture, go forth and multiply. Perhaps it's the role of a mother being celebrated more. Perhaps it's participation in a community where people can help out with child rearing. There are a whole bunch of factors that go into this. But in terms of not discussing it, I mean, again, this goes back to the taboos around race, gender, and sexuality. So if this is touching on the feminism part of that holy trinity, and therefore you can be accused of being a sexist and a misogynist, etc. Simple, knee-jerk, emotional, again, always personalizing, never actually dealing with the problem. Somehow we're going to have to find ways to deal with it. I mean, so one of the standard arguments has been, we just need to make it easier for women to enter and exit the workforce. I think that there is truth to that, but it's not so simple. We're starting to see the real sharp declines of birth rates, even in these northern, very feminist-friendly societies, the Swedens of this world. So I think we do want to make it easy for women to exit and enter the workforce, but that is not going to solve this problem. We're going to have to grapple with the cultural issues as well and the community issues, and that's not a conversation that the left or the institutions want to have, because they don't want to be accused. Again, it all gets back to these taboos, which are at the core, really, of the ideology we're living through. That's kind of whose extreme version is cancel culture and wokeness. We are going to have to. This is again another reason all of these tentacles. Wokeness is not just this abstract debate about free speech. It affects all of these policy areas. We can't have a rational debate about crime, about family policy, because of the same speech suppressing ideology. And so we've got to. I think that's why we have to fight the culture wars and deal with this ideology, or we can't effectively deal with problems like family and fertility and all of these things, which are massively important.
Absolutely. Well, that has been fantastic to speak to you. Extremely interesting. I'm delighted that you do what you're doing and producing your output of the quality that it is. It's a hugely important part, I think, of the cultural movement within the nation. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to get hold of a couple of your books and have a read, very definitely. And I'll look forward from hearing from you again. We'll certainly keep track of what you're doing. And I'll send you out a policy booklet as well. You can have a look at. You might find it interesting.
Fantastic. And yeah, if any listeners are interested, I have this open online course on woke that you can just check out. If you go to my Twitter, it's the pinned tweet. We've got a new center for heterodox research. It's called heterodoxcenter.com. Thanks, Richard. This was great, and keep up your good work too.